Last time I briefly explored the ancient magnetes and the first registered mentions of a magnetic stone during archaic and classical times in Greece, or better, the Eastern Mediterranean in general. One of the things I noticed is how some notable historical figures copy previously written sources instead of basing their claims on their own experiments. Nomination is often wrong. Sometimes the description of locations and such seem to be bogus as well. Fact is that this culture vanished in thin air, or so it seems. It becomes a bit difficult to define whom they transformed into after that. It is unsure whether they were on their way using magnets, although I do found some indications that this may have been the case. But as I said, such historical data is seldom factual. Misinterpretations, misquotings, plagiarizing, and misleading has been of all times. I ended last episode with a mention of the natural magic used by Circe, the goddess, and Medea of Colchis, and I found another story of a witch playing around with lodestones. There are 5 Roman poets who are called the Elegiaci or Elegaci. The best known is probably Ovid. One of Ovid's colleagues, Sextus Propertius, devoted a poem to the witch Acanthus and her precepts on how women should manage men. He ascribed to her different powers, among which the ability to diminish the force from a magnet. To have a better idea of what was going around in archaic times on magnets and lodestones, I searched and found some stories about magnets in myth and magic, and some of that more technical kind maybe. During the 3rd millennium, long-distance trade developed. Stones, minerals, among other goods, were shipped and carried from one continent to another. The contacts between India and Greece during archaic time have long been discussed by historians, and there are also many linguistic similarities that indicate such a contact. Time before Alexander went eastwards and Greek communities were established in Central Asia and India. There is a lot of disagreement whether the influence came from west to east or the other way around. By Western scholars in general, it is assumed that the link between early European languages and Sanskrit must be found in a much earlier time with the Proto-Indian European-speaking people who roamed the steppes west, north, and east of the Black and Caspian Sea, since they easily frequented the borders of the earliest nations in all directions. It has been noticed that there are clear traces of Indian medicinal practice in the West during Antiquity, but none of the European medicinal knowledge has been recorded in India. In other words, this trail, for example, clearly goes east to west and not the other way around. The Greeks in India were referred to as the Yavanas or Ionas, derivation of the word Ionians. Magnetes, for example, were members of the Ionian League. Some sources claim that the Indian people in Greece were generally referred to as the Indios, after the Indus region with which they established a trade contact. It was Democritus who offered the inspiration for the Epicurean atomist philosophy that I mentioned in the last episode. I mentioned their interpretation of the magnetic forces shortly, but Democritus was a tutor for many, among whom Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, and he was known as a man who traveled widely during his lifetime and lived in Egypt and Persia. Democritus based much of his scientific perception on that articulated 2 centuries earlier by the Indian rishi Kanada. The practice of Ayurvedic medicine is more than 2000 years old. Rasa Shastra, which is basically the chemistry involved in Ayurvedic medicine, uses the lodestone in its practice. According to Dioscorides and Galen, both Roman physicians from respectively the 1st and 2nd century AD, say that the lapidary of Aristotle mentioned that a magnet could extract arrows out of wounds. Galen rejects the Epicurean theory of magnetism and aligns with Homer's idea that the phenomenon of attraction displayed by a lodestone is an expression of divinity. I want to underline short here that Galen was born in Izmir, Turkey, which is in the close vicinity of those ancient colonies of the Magnetes called Magnesia. Pliny documented various lodestone locations. One of the best varieties is being blue and from Ethiopia. Pliny reckoned that properly prepared lodestone was useful in treating eye problems and burns. Also, magnets must be worn to cure melancholy and depression, according to Constantinus Africanus. Worn, they will enhance the chance of pregnancy also. And Plutarch claimed that the power of magnetic stones could be diminished by rubbing them into garlic, and this was still proclaimed by authorities during the Middle Ages. One could test the loyalty of a wife, they said, by putting a lodestone under her pillow. If she fell out of bed, one could be assured she was untrustworthy. Popular beliefs and superstitions surrounding the lodestone will continue to exist throughout the centuries, all the way to the beginning of the 2nd millennium, with the rediscovery of the physical properties of the magnet by Gilbert. Iamblichus mentions a Scythian king called Abaris, who rules by the virtue of a golden arrow. Pythagoras was said to be the one who stole this gilded arrow and thus robbed the king of his orientation. This must be one of the oldest indications we have in the area of the use of a magnetic compass. And although vague, but it comes like timely with the Chinese military invention of such a compass, and this tool was used by the Chinese in case the enemy used smoke curtains, so orientation would still be possible. The connection to navigation overseas apparently did not occur according to regular history. The ancient philosophers described the attractive force of magnets as sympathetic or antipathetic. The opposite force of repulsion within one stone was considered the consequence of 2 different minerals being joined within the lodestone. The stone they considered feminine was called Tiamides. The phenomenon itself was called Tiamidism. This Tiamides is referred to by Pliny as the name of one of 2 particular mountains, one with attractive, the other with repelling force, so much that one could get stuck or be cast away when wearing iron. Some sources claim the origins of this myth lies in India, while others claim it is located in East Africa, and more specifically in Ethiopia, like I said. Of course, neither places have such mountains, but this discrepancy is maybe exemplary for the distortion that has taken place for whatever reason. Shortly, another such possible distorted history is there's mention of several cases of statues of deities floating in thin air in their respective temples. There is even one story of a statue suspended above a tent, but since that statue was claimed to represent Muhammad, I reckon That is one of the more fantastic derivatives of one maybe true story, if there is a true story. One story goes back to King Ptolemy of Egypt and his wife Arsinoe. It goes that Ptolemy was so saddened after her death that he ordered a statue of her should be erected in every temple in the country. Dinocrates, the architect of Alexander the Great, was ordered to build a lifelike statue which should be suspended in a temple in Alexandria, but the project was never completed since king and architect died before that time. Tyrannius Rufius of Aquila claimed that the temple of Serapis in Alexandria had magnetized ceilings or walls, that it held a statue of the solar deity made of bronze with an iron core or head. Powerful magnets would keep it afloat. Some sophistication would not be too strange to Alexandria, known as an ancient technopolis, but the possibilities have been invalidated long ago, so I read. Maybe it should be re-examined. In an old book called The History of the Works of the Learned, Volume 1, written in 1743, I find something on Egypt and the lodestone that may be of significance. In his Iside et Oriside, Plutarch recounts the words of Manito. The lodestone, he says, is the mouth of Horus, and iron is the mouth of Typhon. This Typhon is another name for Set. The two deities are bound in involuntary union, attracted and repulsed. Typhon is originally a Hittite storm god. This identification with Set is one of later times, a nice example of syncretism. What is of importance is the indication to the knowledge of the later Egyptian societies of the dual properties of the lodestone. A similar story is told about one black ruined temple of the Konark temple complex in Odisha, built in 1200 AD India. It supposedly had a statue of a deity suspended inside the inner sanctum of the temple, and on top of the dome there was a 40 tons or plus 40 tons lodestone that held the complete temple together. Portuguese sailors who could no longer steer their ships safely along the Sea of Bengal because of the powerful magnet ripping their ships apart, are said to have stolen the magnet, and consequently the building fell apart. There is Portuguese naval records that tell us another story. While sailing near Goa and Bombay, the Portuguese naval officer João de Castro discovered magnetic declination in his compass caused by nearby ferrous rocks. Only a few decades later, or earlier, before the end of the 15th century, another more famous Portuguese explorer, Vasco da Gama, already noted that the magnetic compass was known to the Indian sailors. So a short resume: for Thales, a lodestone had what he called the soul of life, and this caused this stone and its effect on iron to become a favorable subjects of writers and poets. Other scholastic terms like sympathy and occult duality were abandoned by the Pythagorean school, which paved the road for the atomists. Plato's Timaeus description of the magnets are based on the works of those early Greek scholars like Democritus. What we learn is that the experimental philosophers and naturalists, they should have well been aware of the double nature of the lodestones, in my opinion. There are no writings left to prove it, though. Pliny, centuries later, still inserts the Tiamidis mountain fable into his natural histories, claiming it to be one of two mountains in the Indus region, one with extreme repelling, the other with extreme attractive force. Another few centuries later, Isidore of Seville repeats that same urban legend on Pliny's Lapis Indicus. Beliefs have a tendency to overpower knowledge. Still, some questions remain unanswered, and again, what caught my attention is the little hints to the Indo-European cultures. There is Magnesia, both in East Thessaly, Greece, and in Anatolia. But there are also the Colchian goddess witches and the Scythian king with the gilded arrow, which, as Iamblichus put it, qua se gubernat, which steered his course. If some of the so-called Scythians actually did have knowledge of the advantages of magnetic compass, it would be temporary with the use of such by the Chinese warring states and the first emperors for military purposes, as is documented. For late Neolithic cultures, stone was more valuable than most of us grasp. I would think they did have knowledge of the special properties of magnetite, including its bipolarity. But of course, it is not that simple. Iron still had to be invented during the Cycladic heydays, at least according to the official narrative that we, the public, are acquainted with. I am no subscriber of the odd classifications used in history class, dividing our past in distinct timelines. Such clear-cut methods of definition are as valuable as statistics, in my opinion. They look neat, but they have little content. As far as I have seen and read now, I think it is very reasonable to consider the possibility that lode-stones served as a guide during navigating large water in times long before European colonial expansion, and not necessarily only in the East by Indians and Chinese. 1,000 years is a mighty long time for such international contacts not to have been established somehow, also across large bodies of water. I still have some more to add, aspects of a more secretive nature and just factoids that I found along the search. But I am abroad as of now for a while, so it's not really clear when I will have the chance to make videos, but I will finish this mini-series on the lodestones in the coming episode. Thanks for watching and take care.